they fired the quiet black technician on a Monday morning. By 2 o'clock Tuesday, the hospital he had quietly kept alive for 8 years was dying in the dark. Not all at once. That would have been easier. What happened instead was something slower and more dangerous. A half collapse, the kind where monitors still glow green while the walls quietly stop holding. The kind where a baby in the neonatal intensive care unit starts pulling oxygen that the system doesn't know it needs to protect. The kind that no spreadsheet on Earth can predict, because spreadsheets don't know the difference between a hallway light and a ventilator. Darius Hale did. That was the whole problem. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, because this story is about someone you've probably never noticed doing a job you didn't know existed, in a building you've trusted with your life. The morning it all began, St. Mercy Regional Medical Center moved the way hospitals always move, with purposeful exhaustion that never fully stops. An ambulance rolled through the bay doors at 6:42, its lights still spinning in the gray October rain. A nurse pushed a gurney down the east corridor, her sneakers squeaking in rhythm with the IV pump on the rail. In the waiting room, a man in his 60s slept upright in a plastic chair, head tilted back at an angle that would hurt later. He had stopped hearing the PA sometime around midnight. Beneath all of it, beneath the footsteps and the beeping and the low murmur of a hospital that never sleeps, there was a sound most people missed. A hum. The long exhale of machines doing their work in rooms without windows, servers processing records, generators cycling on standby, electrical panels routing current to every room in a building that housed, that morning, 211 patients. Darius Hale noticed it. He had been noticing it for 8 years. He moved through the lower corridor, the way a man moves, through a place he knows better than his own apartment. Down the stairs to the basement level, past the utility closets, to the electrical room, where the main distribution panels lived behind a steel door. He had memorized the combination so long ago he couldn't remember learning it. He checked the display on the generator transfer switch. He looked at the humidity sensor mounted near the east wall, the one he'd installed himself after noticing the concrete sweated during heavy rain. He noted a fluctuation in MercyGrid's load distribution log, a small one, the kind that took a trained eye to see. He wrote it in the spiral notebook he kept in his left breast pocket, the same notebook he'd been filling for 3 years. He was not supposed to be fixing it that morning. He was supposed to be upstairs. Maya was with him because school had let out at noon, Parent-Teacher Professional Development Day. Darius had spent 20 minutes trying to reach his neighbor before giving up and bringing his 7-year-old daughter to work. She sat in the technician's break room off the second basement level, cross-legged on a folding chair, her coloring book open across her knees, wearing the noise-canceling headphones he'd bought her for days like this. Button was wedged between her hip and the armrest. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Daddy," she said, sliding one headphone cup off her ear, "does the hospital sleep?" He thought about it the way he always thought about her questions, as though they deserved the same consideration he gave to a system error. "It doesn't sleep, baby. It rests parts of itself at a time, but somebody has to watch the lights." She nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer and pulled the headphone back over her ear. He watched her for another 3 seconds before heading upstairs. The meeting room on the 4th floor had glass walls. Darius could see it from the elevator. 3 men in suits that cost more than his monthly rent. A woman he recognized as the new CFO's assistant, and CFO Nolan Pierce himself, standing at the head of the conference table, with his hands in his pockets like a man who has already decided the outcome of whatever is about to be discussed. Sitting at the far end, reviewing something on a tablet, was Dr. Evelyn Cross. 6 weeks into her tenure as CEO of St. Mercy, already known in the building for moving fast and sleeping less than anyone had a right to. Darius did not go in. He was not invited to go in. He went instead to the Network Operations Center 3 doors down and spent the next 20 minutes running a diagnostic on the backup server cluster. He was still running it when HR called him. The room they used was small, a ficus in the corner, a box of tissues on the desk that had never been opened. The HR coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had always been perfectly pleasant to him, sat across the table with a folder open in front of her, and the expression of someone delivering news they did not write. Darius, as part of a restructuring initiative, he had heard the language before, not directed at him, but he had heard it. Tipped from coffee cups in hallways murmured near vending machines. The hospital was bringing in an outside technology consulting firm, Callaway Digital. 3 specialists who would modernize the infrastructure, migrate legacy systems to the cloud, and reduce operational headcount in the IT and maintenance departments. The position of senior systems technician was being eliminated. He would receive 3 months of severance pay. His access credentials would be terminated by end of business. Sandra finished talking. Darius said nothing for a moment. The ficus stood between them in the particular silence of a room where difficult things are said. "What about MercyGrid?" he asked. Sandra blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The emergency load distribution system. The one integrated with the generator transfer protocols. What's the handover plan?" Before she could answer, the door opened. Nolan Pierce entered with the unhurried energy of a man who considered interruptions his right. Behind him was Brent Callaway, 35, sharp-jawed, wearing a fitted charcoal blazer over a shirt with no tie, the specific uniform of someone who wanted to look serious but not stuffy. He was followed by 2 younger team members who stood near the wall like assistants at a press conference. "We've reviewed the full documentation," Nolan said. "Brent's team is prepared to transition." Darius looked at Brent. "Has anyone told them what happens if the emergency load grid loses synchronization during a generator transfer under storm load conditions?" Brent smiled, not unkindly, but with the particular confidence of someone who has read a manual and confused that with understanding the machine. "We've gone through the system documentation thoroughly." Darius looked at him for a long moment. "So that's a no." He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He looked at Nolan once. A look that said nothing dramatic and everything necessary, then pushed back from the table and stood. He went back to the break room and collected Maya. He folded her coloring book and tucked it into her backpack. He zipped her jacket. She handed him button without being asked, knowing he would carry the rabbit while she put her arms through the straps. They stopped at his office. His former office, for exactly 4 minutes. He took a ceramic mug with a chip in the handle that he'd been drinking coffee from for 6 years. He took the photograph of Maya and Leah from the corner of his desk, the one taken on the hospital grounds, the summer before Leah got sick, the 2 of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something Darius had said off camera. He took a personal USB drive, empty, that had never held hospital data. He left his maintenance manuals on the shelf. He left his spiral notebooks, all 7 of them, covering 8 years of observations, error logs, and handwritten correction protocols, in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, labeled clearly. He did not take them. They belonged to St. Mercy. He had written them for St. Mercy. If someone bothered to read them, they would be worth more than everything Brent Callaway's firm was being paid. He did not sabotage the system. He did not corrupt a single file. He walked out of the building with a cardboard box in one arm and his daughter's hand in the other. Maya's backpack shaped like a turtle bouncing against her spine, button tucked under Darius's elbow, with her glass eyes staring back at the hospital entrance as the automatic doors slid shut. Maya didn't ask what had happened until they were in the car. "Daddy, did they not need you anymore?" He adjusted the rearview mirror so he could see her face. "They think so," she considered this, "but the hospital needs the lights." "Yes, it does. So who watches them now?" He didn't answer right away. He pulled out of the parking structure into the gray morning rain, the windshield wipers keeping their steady count, and let the question sit between them in the car. The apartment they lived in was 12 minutes from St. Mercy, 3rd floor of a building that was now simply functional, clean, solid, nothing more. Maya had chosen the east-facing room because she liked to watch the sky lighten in the mornings. That afternoon, he made soup because it was something to do with his hands. He checked Maya's reading log while the broth simmered. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug going cold beside him and pulled up his email, where 7 messages from recruiters had been sitting unanswered for weeks. Because he had not been planning to leave, he was planning now. He stared at the bills and thought about the 3 months of severance, and beyond that the open space that opens in a man's chest when he calculates what comes next. He had been through worse. He had sat in a hospital waiting room at 2 in the morning with Maya asleep across 3 chairs and learned that Leah was not going to recover. He had driven home at dawn and told a 4-year-old that mommy wasn't coming back, and done it without breaking in front of her, and broken alone in the shower afterward. This was not that, but it was still the particular grief of being told you are less necessary than you know yourself to be. Leah would have known what to say. She had been a diagnostic sonographer at St. Mercy, the kind of person who saw what was happening inside the body before anyone else did, who read images in the dark and found the truth in them. She believed that every room in a hospital was a room where someone's story was being decided, and that the people who worked in those rooms, all of them, from the surgeons to the janitors, were part of a system of care that only worked when every part remembered its purpose. Electricity in a hospital isn't electricity, she told him once, early in their relationship, when he was still a contract engineer who planned to move on after 18 months. They were sitting on the back steps of their first apartment, watching the city at night, the hospital visible in the distance, with its permanent glow. The lights in the hallways are how families find each other at midnight. The power on a ventilator is someone's child breathing. The record system is the memory of a body that can't remember its own history. She leaned against his shoulder. Don't let anyone tell you that's just maintenance work. He hadn't, not in his heart. But his title said Senior Systems Technician, and the people in the glass conference room read titles. He'd been offered a different title once, Director of Infrastructure Operations, with a corner office and evening availability, travel to industry summits. They offered it 8 months after Leah died, when Maya was 3, and screaming every night for a mother who wasn't coming back. He looked at the offer letter for a long time. Then he walked into his supervisor's office and said he needed a schedule he could count on. His supervisor tried once to argue that Darius was limiting his career. Darius said his daughter was not a limitation. His daughter was his career's entire reason for existing. He kept the technical role. He kept the predictable hours. He kept building MercyGrid in the margins of his shifts, because 8 years ago, there had been a power incident, 22 seconds, and a premature infant in the NICU had desaturated before the backup system fully loaded. Nothing irreversible happened. But Darius had sat in the stairwell afterward, with his hands between his knees, and understood that this was not acceptable, and that he was positioned to fix it. He designed MercyGrid over 7 months, working evenings after Maya was in bed, filling notebooks with circuit logic and load calculations and failure mode analyses. It was not elegant software. Brent Calloway would have called it legacy architecture, and he would not have been wrong. But it knew St. Mercy specifically, its electrical idiosyncrasies, backup generator timing sequences, the way the NICU drew power differently from surgical suites, the millisecond gaps in transfer switching that could, under exactly the wrong conditions, leave a ventilator without current long enough to matter. MercyGrid knew all of that, and now Darius had been removed from the building. That evening, he put Maya to bed and sat by her door in the dark until her breathing evened out. He went back to the kitchen table and opened the weather service on his laptop. The storm system that had been tracking offshore for 3 days was accelerating. Projected landfall to the north, but the outer bands would reach the city by midnight. Wind gusts to 60 miles per hour. Rainfall totals unprecedented for October. He looked at the laptop screen for a long time. He picked up his phone. He put it back down. He was no longer employed by St. Mercy Regional Medical Center. He had no standing to call anyone there, no access codes, no credentials, and there was something in him. The same thing that had allowed him to walk out that morning, without A scene, without a threat, without a single dramatic word, that would not let him make unsolicited warnings to people who had just told him he was unnecessary. He had said his piece, once clearly, in a small room. They had smiled. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Across the city, in the building whose hum he had spent 8 years learning like a language, Brent Calloway sat in the Network Operations Center with his 2 team members and reviewed the MercyGrid status dashboard on a monitor that showed everything green. Chloe, his cloud systems analyst, was mapping the architecture for migration. Miles, his youngest engineer, and the one who had been quietly uneasy since their first walkthrough, was annotating the system documentation. Miles had found the warning earlier that afternoon, embedded in a comment block in the state management module. A single line of text, in Darius's characteristic style. No dramatics, just precision. Do not reset sync state flags during storm load mode. Generator phase offset cannot self-correct under concurrent hydro conditions. Manual recalibration required. See Notebook 4, page 31. He had flagged it for Brent. Brent had read it and typed a single word in response: legacy. What he meant was that it was the kind of warning an overcautious engineer writes to protect his own position. A keep-out sign that implies the machine cannot be understood without its creator. Brent had seen this pattern before, in legacy systems maintained by single individuals who feared being replaced. He had cleaned up after a dozen of them in corporate environments. He logged the comment as a known issue for later review and moved on. He was not a careless person. He was a person who trusted his model of the world, and his model said that hospital IT systems, while specialized, responded to the same logic as enterprise infrastructure. The documentation was thorough. The architecture was unusual but comprehensible. The warning was probably over-calibrated by a man who wanted to feel indispensable. By 10:30 that night, the rain was loud against the exterior windows. Nurse Alina Reyes had been on shift since 7. She was the charge nurse for the neonatal intensive care unit, a position she had held for 6 years, and she had in that time developed a calibrated sensitivity to the behavior of machines that most nurses called instinct, and Alina called pattern recognition. She had worked enough night shifts through enough weather events to know what the lights did when the building was under stress. The fluorescence in the NICU had a particular flicker. Not a real flicker, barely perceptible, more like a holding of breath, that she associated with the generator transfer system preparing to adjust. She had seen it twice that night. She went to the Network Operations Center at 10:55 and knocked on the open door. Brent was at the console. Miles was behind him. "Where's Darius?" she asked. Brent turned. "He's no longer with the facility. We're managing the systems now." She looked at him the way she looked at a scan result she didn't like. "Have you ever been in this unit when the power hiccups? We have experience with large-scale infrastructure under varied conditions." "I've been in the NICU when the lights blinked for 8 seconds, she said. "I know what it costs." "Do you?" He held her gaze. "We'll have everything stable through the storm." She looked past him at the dashboard, green across all indicators. She looked at the windows, where the rain was now sheeting sideways. She looked back at him. "Darius used to go down to the basement before weather like this," she said. "He said he could hear when the machines were nervous." Brent said nothing. She went back to her unit. Walter Kim had worked security at St. Mercy for 14 years. He was 62, a compact man, with a deliberate way of moving and eyes that had seen enough of hospitals to carry a quiet sadness he never talked about. He had watched Darius come in every morning for 8 years. He had watched Maya grow from an infant in a carrier on Darius's chest, in the early months after Leah died, when there was nowhere else to take her on weekends, to the 7-year-old who greeted Walter by asking him what the word of the day was, because he always had one ready. Walter was at his post near the main entrance at 11:45 when the outer bands of the storm hit in earnest. He watched the oaks in the parking lot bend. He heard the sound the wind made when it found the gap in the ambulance bay doors. He looked at the lobby lights and waited. At 11:58, A maintenance worker named Jean came up from the basement with a look Walter had learned to read. "Humidity sensor in the east mechanical room," Jean said. "Climbing." "How fast?" "Fast. Something's wrong with the drainage." Walter said, "Who did you tell?" Jean said he'd called the operations center. Brent had told him to log it and monitor. Walter looked at Jean. Then he took out his personal phone and scrolled to a contact saved not in the hospital directory, but in his own private list, numbers for people who mattered, not by job title, but by presence. He didn't call yet. He waited to see what happened. At 2:03 in the morning, the main electrical grid flickered under the storm surge load. The transfer relay engaged and the backup generator came online in 0.4 seconds. Within spec, within tolerance. Under normal conditions, MercyGrid's state management system would have handled the transition seamlessly, reading the current draw profiles from each active department and routing backup power according to its priority hierarchy. Life-critical equipment first, intensive care units second, surgical suites third, administrative and non-essential systems last. But the sync state flags had been reset. When Brent's team ran the legacy cleanup script that afternoon, they had wiped the state memory that MercyGrid used to understand what load conditions it was operating under. The system had rebooted into what it believed was a standard daytime configuration. Low patient acuity, normal demand distribution, no concurrent high draw scenarios. It had no knowledge of the 3 premature infants currently on ventilators in the NICU. No knowledge of the vascular surgery ongoing in Suite 2. No knowledge of the 5 patients in the emergency department requiring continuous monitoring. It knew how to do its job. It simply no longer knew what situation it was doing that job in. For 11 seconds, the power rerouted according to daytime assumptions. Hallway lighting in non-critical zones held. Office systems held. The NICU's central monitoring display, the one that aggregated all 12 patient feeds into a single screen visible from the nursing station, dropped off the network. The ventilator serving bed 4 ran on its internal battery. The internal hospital communication system slowed to a crawl. The elevator carrying a patient from the emergency department to the ICU stopped between the 3rd and 4th floors. Alina looked at the blank central monitoring screen and was on the radio in 4 seconds. "I need operations now. NICU central monitor is down. Bed 4 vent is on battery." Brent stared at his dashboard. It still showed green on the primary readout. The display refresh was on a 15-second cycle, and the event was only 11 seconds old. Miles said very quietly, "Brent, see it." "Brent." The warning said, "Don't reset sync state under storm load." Brent's hand hovered over the keyboard. The fastest correction he knew was a full system reset. Restore defaults. Let the system rebuild from scratch. It was the standard enterprise recovery protocol. He pulled up the command. Alina's voice came over the building intercom, flat and clear as a verdict. "If you execute a full system reset right now, you will drop load priority for every life-critical device in this building for up to 90 seconds during the rebuild sequence. I will personally document every name on that command log." His hand stopped. Evelyn Cross arrived in the operations center at 2:17, still in the clothes she'd been wearing at a dinner meeting 4 hours earlier. She had been called by her deputy, who had been called by Nolan Pierce, who had arrived 11 minutes before her, looking like a man trying to hold his face in the shape of composure. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. She was good at reading rooms. It was, arguably, her primary skill, reading the emotional weather of an organization the way a navigator reads actual weather, and adjusting course accordingly. What she read in this room was controlled panic. Brent at the console working faster than he wanted to appear to be working. Miles beside him, with a technical manual open on his tablet. Nolan near the window with his hands in his pockets. Alina's voice still crackling through the intercom, with updates from the NICU. Evelyn said, "What's the timeline on stabilization?" Brent said, "We're working through it." Alina's voice came through the speaker. "Bed 4 has 7 minutes on battery at current draw." Evelyn looked at Nolan. She said, "Call Darius Hale." Nolan said, "We terminated his. I know what we did this morning." Her voice was exactly the same temperature. "Call him." Nolan pulled out his phone. He had Darius's work email, which was already deactivated. He had a number in the HR system that rang and rang. Sandra in HR, reached at home and half asleep, had another number that turned out to be a year old. Brent's assistant, when asked, realized she had never learned Darius's last name. Walter Kim walked into the operations center at 2:22, uninvited, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who has decided that protocol can wait. "I have his number," Walter said. Everyone turned. "I keep numbers for the people who actually keep this building running." He looked at Nolan without any particular expression. "You keep the org chart, I keep the people." He dialed. Darius picked up on the second ring. Walter said, "St. Mercy's lights are out, son." There was a silence on the other end that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In it, Darius sat up in the dark of his bedroom, and in the 3 seconds, he ran through what he knew. The storm's trajectory, the humidity reading he'd noted that morning, the warning he'd written in the spiral notebook, the reset that Brent had almost certainly run to clean up legacy flags. He asked 3 questions. Is NICU still on its main feed or battery? Has anyone run a full system reset? Are the generators running in parallel or isolated? Walter handed the phone to Evelyn. "Mr. Hale," she said, "we need you here." Another silence. This one was different. She understood, even without knowing him, that she was not listening to a man deciding whether to help. She was listening to a man doing something more complicated, thinking about a sleeping child in the next room, calculating what needed to happen first. Maya was 7 years old, and not as asleep as she had appeared. She had heard her father's voice change when the phone rang, had heard the specific quality of alertness that came into him, and she opened her eyes in the dark of her room to find him standing in her doorway. "Is it the hospital?" she asked. He nodded. She reached for button, pressed the rabbit against her chest, and said, with the certainty of someone who had already thought it through, "Go watch the lights, Daddy." He called Mrs. Patterson next door, awake anyway because of the storm, who came immediately in her housecoat and slippers. Then Darius pulled on jeans and a hoodie and his waterproof jacket, grabbed the duffel bag from the closet, tools, a spare notebook, a headlamp, and walked into the storm. He did not call a car. He drove himself, because driving meant 3 extra minutes and he needed to think. He knew before he arrived what the failure mode was. He had written it in Notebook 4, page 31. Without sync state data, MercyGrid would allocate power as though it were midday on a Tuesday in April. To correct it without a full reset, which would be catastrophically worse before it got better, he would need to rebuild the state manually, feeding it the current load profile from each department in sequence, coaxing the system into understanding its own situation, the way you might talk a person through a moment of disorientation. He knew how to do this. He had rehearsed it in his head 100 times. Walter met him at the emergency entrance with a temporary access badge, and the particular calm of a man who has been expecting this for some time. Darius shook his hand once briefly. "Bed 4 in NICU?" Darius said. "Alina's with her. How's the drainage in the east mechanical room?" "Jean says it's holding. Barely." He went to the operations center without stopping. The room looked different at 2:30 in the morning under partial emergency power. Smaller somehow, the shadows closer. Evelyn was there. Nolan was there. Brent was at the console with the expression of a man who has been confident in a room for too long, and has only recently understood what was required. Nolan said, "Darius, we appreciate you coming in under." Darius walked past him. He looked at Brent. "Did you run the reset command?" Brent said very quietly. "Partially. I cleared the sync state flags this afternoon during the cleanup." Darius closed his eyes, one breath. Then, "Move." Evelyn nodded once at Brent, who stood and stepped back from the console without argument. Darius sat down. He did not look at any of the primary dashboard readouts. He pulled up the low-level system logs. The raw data feed beneath the display layer, the numbers that the dashboard was summarizing and smoothing and presenting in a form designed to look manageable. This was where the truth lived. This was where MercyGrid was telling anyone willing to listen exactly what it knew and what it had lost. He opened his radio channel. "Alina, still on?" Her voice came back immediately. "Here, bed 4 is holding." "How long?" "Depends on the mechanical room." "Jean, you there?" The maintenance line crackled. "Here, bus B on the east side. Don't touch the yellow breaker. Tell me what the coupling pressure reads." While Jean was answering, Darius was already typing. Not reset commands, not overrides, but a sequence of manual state entries, feeding MercyGrid what it should have remembered. Current time, storm load mode, active department profiles, ventilator counts, surgical suite status. He was reconstructing the system's memory of itself, one entry at a time. Brent moved closer, looking over his shoulder. After a moment he said quietly, "I can run the verification loops if you tell me the sequence." Darius said, "Can you read Python?" "Yes." "Then stop trying to be in charge and be the second pair of hands." Miles moved in on the other side. Darius directed them both without ceremony, Brent running verification, Miles monitoring the generator coupling data as it came from Jean. Both of them working with a speed and precision that had not been available to them an hour earlier, because an hour earlier, they had believed they knew what they were doing. They were learning, in real time, the difference between knowing a system and knowing it under the conditions that matter. At 2:47, Alina's voice came through sharp. "Darius, bed 4 is pulling hard." He had already seen it. The ventilator on bed 4 was compensating for a pressure irregularity, increasing its draw, pulling from the battery at a rate that would exhaust it in under 4 minutes. At the same time, the surgical suite on the second floor was at a critical juncture in the vascular procedure. The attending had been clear that they needed stable imaging for at least 2 more minutes. He could route additional load to the NICU now, pulling it from somewhere else. Or he could hold the surgical suite stable for another 2 minutes and hope the NICU battery held. He looked at the power map. He looked at what could be cut without consequence. The administrative server cluster, full backup, non-essential overnight. The north parking structure lighting. The executive wing on the 4th floor, which was empty. "Evelyn," he said. She was behind him. "Yes, I can reroute power from the admin servers and the executive offices to NICU right now. You'll lose about 50 minutes of log data from the administrative systems. The primary patient records are safe, but the overnight operational logs will have a gap." "Do it," she said. "There's also a chance the temporary routing causes an artifact in the transfer record. The auditors won't like it. The auditors aren't standing in the NICU." He executed the reroute. The ventilator on bed 4 stabilized within 20 seconds. Alina confirmed. He could hear, faintly through the radio, the sound of a small person breathing steadily, and it was one of the few sounds in the world that had ever made him feel something close to peace. The next 40 minutes were the work itself, methodical, unglamorous, requiring total concentration and no heroics. He rebuilt MercyGrid's state layer by layer, testing each restoration before moving to the next, declining twice to take shortcuts that would have been faster but introduced new variables. At 3:29, he ran the final synchronization check. The system's load distribution aligned with actual conditions for the first Vistar time since the cleanup script had wiped its memory. The lights in the NICU returned to full brightness. The central monitoring display came back online. The imaging system in surgical suite 2 confirmed stable feed. The elevator between the 3rd and 4th floors received a manual override command and descended to the 3rd floor, where the patient was transferred via stairs, a delay that had caused great anxiety and no harm. Nobody clapped. This was not a place where people clapped when things went right, because things going right was the only acceptable outcome. What happened instead was that everyone in the operations center let out a breath, one after another, and the room changed the way a room changes when the danger has moved from present to past. Walter, standing in the doorway, nodded once. That was enough. The sun came up gray and wet. The storm had moved northeast overnight, leaving behind scattered debris and the deep scrubbed smell of October air after rain. St. Mercy held its morning briefings an hour late. The cafeteria opened at 6 instead of 5:30. In the NICU, The 3 premature infants who had come through the night were stable, each one being attended to by nurses who looked like people who had not slept enough but would not have traded the shift. In the small conference room on the 4th floor, the glass-walled one, where Nolan had stood with his hands in his pockets just one day earlier, Evelyn Cross asked a question that she had been turning over since 3 in the morning. How does a system that critical depend entirely on one person, and why did no one tell me? The room was quieter than it had been at the previous meeting. Darius was there, Alina Reyes was there, Walter Kim was there, Nolan and Brent were there. A representative from the facility's maintenance team, a man named Gene who still had equipment grease on his forearms, was there because Evelyn had specifically asked that he be included. Nobody answered right away. Alina said, "Because people who read reports count what gets measured. We don't write reports about what happens at 2 in the morning when someone who knows the building prevents an incident before it becomes an incident. That's just called Tuesday." Evelyn opened her laptop. She had spent part of the early morning reviewing files, not the summary reports she'd been given before signing the termination order, but the underlying documentation, the emails, the flagged items, the budget requests. She found 3 separate proposals from Darius over 4 years requesting funding to cross-train an additional technician in MercyGrid operations. Each had been declined by the finance office under Nolan's direction. She found a memo noting the east mechanical room drainage needed reinforcement before storm season. Declined. She found a section in the original consulting firm assessment, the one Nolan had used to justify the restructuring, where a risk flag had been added under the heading "Single Point of Operational Knowledge" and then removed from the version presented to her. She looked at Nolan. Nolan began to say something about documentation requirements and transition timelines. "You removed a section from the risk assessment before giving it to me," Evelyn said. Nolan said it had been characterized as low probability. "You characterized it, not the person who wrote it." She closed the laptop. "You made a decision about acceptable risk and told me it wasn't a risk, and you put that risk on the backs of patients who didn't know they were being gambled with." The room was quiet. Darius had not spoken. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the window, where the wet parking lot reflected a sky that was beginning to clear. Brent spoke. "I didn't take the warning seriously because it looked like a legacy system owner protecting his territory." He said it plainly, without excuses in his voice. "I was wrong. Not about what the warning said, about what it meant." Darius looked at him. "The warning wasn't there to protect my territory. I was going to leave eventually. I wrote it so whoever came after me wouldn't be standing where you were standing last night." Brent held his gaze. "I understand that now." Nolan Pierce resigned before week's end. The board requested an independent audit of all cost-cutting measures from the prior 18 months. The consulting contract with Callaway Digital was restructured, with Brent and Miles retained in a support capacity pending a full review. Evelyn Cross found Darius in the corridor outside the security office, where Maya had spent the night hours curled under a blanket on the small couch, button tucked against her chest, sleeping through most of the crisis with the deep unconsciousness of children who trust that the adults are managing things. Maya was awake now. She was sitting beside Walter eating a granola bar that Walter had produced from somewhere, listening to him explain the difference between a manual and an automatic door lock, which she apparently found fascinating. When she saw her father, she slid off the couch and came to him, and he put his hand on the top of her head, the way he always did, the gesture that meant both hello and I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Evelyn watched this and understood something about the conversation she was about to have. "I owe you an apology," she said, "and I want to give you a real one, not a liability management one. I was paid to understand who keeps this hospital functioning. I didn't, that's on me." Darius looked at her. "Your mistake almost cost a child her life." She did not look away. "Yes, it did." There was a pause. Maya, sensing something significant, stopped eating her granola bar. "What I want to say next," Evelyn said a job offer, but I want to say it right. The title she proposed was Director of Critical Systems Resilience. It came with a salary she named outright, more than he had been making. It came with full authority to hire and train 2 additional engineers, a capital budget for MercyGrid upgrades and the mechanical room work and the other items from his declined proposals, and a standing seat on the Emergency Operations Committee alongside clinical leads and department chiefs. She intended to reconstitute that committee with the people who actually knew what happened when things went wrong. It also came with something he had not expected. A commitment, written into the offer, that the hospital would maintain emergency childcare support for staff working crisis situations. She was going to have to build it from scratch. Darius was quiet for a while. "I don't want to be the only person they call at 2 in the morning, he said finally. "That's not resilience. That's just dependence with a different face." "Agreed. If I come back, it's to build a system where no one person is the single point of failure, including me. That's the job I'm describing." He looked at Maya, who had been watching with the focused attention of a child who understands that something important is being decided even when she doesn't have all the words for it. She looked back at him with button pressed against her chest and said nothing, which was its own kind of vote. He said, "I need to think about it tonight." He called the following morning and said yes. The changes at St. Mercy were not dramatic in the way that stories about institutions sometimes present change. They were the slower kind, the kind that accumulates in procedures and habits, and who gets invited to which meetings, and whose number gets saved in whose phone. Miles turned out to have a genuine talent for systems documentation. Darius began teaching him MercyGrid from the inside out. Not from the manual but from the experience. The way knowledge that matters is always transmitted. A second engineer named Keisha was hired 3 weeks later and immediately began asking the right questions, which Darius recognized as the first reliable sign that someone was going to be good at this. The east mechanical room drainage system was reinforced. The humidity sensors were upgraded to real-time wireless alerts. Notebook 4 was photocopied and placed in 3 locations in the building, because Darius had decided he would rather make himself unnecessary than indispensable. Alina Reyes was given a direct alert pathway to the system's operations center. Walter Kim was included in the emergency drill program, because the person who saw what was happening at the entrance at 11:45 was part of the early warning system, whether the org chart said so or not. 4 weeks after his return, Darius ran a full simulated outage drill and stood at the back of the room, while Miles and Keisha worked through the sequence. They made one mistake, corrected it in 40 seconds, without being told what was wrong. He did not intervene. He watched them find it. When it was over, Evelyn asked how long before they could handle a real event without him in the room. 6 months, he said, if we keep drilling. And then I teach the next 2. That was what he meant by the word resilience, not the presence of a person who cannot be replaced. The absence of conditions under which any one person's removal could bring a system to its knees. Maya came to the hospital on a Thursday after school, the way she sometimes did, now that there was a small room set aside for staff children near the security office. She walked in with her turtle backpack and button tucked under her arm, and went immediately to the bulletin board, where the new Systems Resilience team had pinned their drill schedules and project timelines. She studied it with the same attention she gave to things she found interesting, fully, without distraction. When Darius came out to meet her, she pointed at his badge. "What's director mean, Daddy?" He thought for a moment. "It means I make sure the lights know where they're supposed to go." She considered this, like a traffic person but for electricity, something like that. She nodded, satisfied, and handed him a folded piece of paper. "I made you something." He unfolded it carefully. It was drawn in her good-colored pencils, the Prismacolors she kept in the flat tin case he'd bought her for her last birthday. It showed a building that was unmistakably St. Mercy, rendered in the particular proportions of a child's perspective, slightly too tall, windows evenly spaced, every window glowing warm yellow. Below the building, in a basement level that she had drawn as visible, like a cross-section, stood a figure, a man, small, holding a flashlight with a beam that spread upward through the floors. Rain fell in careful diagonal lines above the building. In her careful, slightly uneven handwriting across the bottom she had written, "My daddy keeps the lights awake." He stood in the hallway and looked at the drawing for a long time. Alina found him there a few minutes later and asked if he was all right. He said yes. She looked at the drawing and didn't say anything, because some things don't require a response. Later that afternoon, she brought Darius and Maya through the NICU on their way to the elevator. A young mother was sitting beside an incubator in the far corner. Could not have been more than 25, wearing a sweatshirt from a college she had probably attended 2 or 3 years ago. Her hair in a bun that had come half undone. She was reading aloud from a picture book to the infant inside the incubator, her voice low and steady, as though the consistency of the sound mattered more than the words. She looked up when they passed. She didn't know who Darius was. She said to Alina, with the conversational ease of someone whose entire world had, for the past 12 days, been this room. "I heard the storm almost knocked out the power. I was so scared when I heard that. I'm glad everything stayed on." Maya looked up at her father. Darius looked at the woman and her child. He said, "Everybody here is good at their job," and smiled briefly, and they moved on. In the elevator, Maya tugged his sleeve. "Why didn't you tell her it was you?" He pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid closed. "Because the baby's breathing, that's the whole point." Maya was quiet for a floor. Then she said, "But I know." He looked down at her. She had button under one arm and his drawing under the other, and she was looking at him with the directness that children have before the world teaches them to look at things sideways. "Yeah," he said. "You do. Is that enough?" The elevator opened. He put his hand on the top of her head. That gesture, that same gesture, and they walked out into the lobby together, where the afternoon light came through the glass doors, and the automatic door opened for them. And the hospital hummed behind them, steady, aware of its own requirements, kept whole by the hands of people whose names do not appear in annual reports or hospital brochures, or the grateful posts that patients write when they go home. There are people who work where no one looks, below the floors that matter in the official photographs, behind doors marked with codes that only certain people know. In mechanical rooms and generator bays that make a building function, while remaining invisible to the people the building serves. They do not wear the white coat. The families in the corridors do not know their faces. But there are evenings, in storm season, in the small hours, when the difference between a patient who goes home and one who does not comes down to one person who understood, before anyone else did, which light had to stay on first. St. Mercy had called Darius Hale a redundant cost, a line on a spreadsheet, a position to be absorbed into a streamlined configuration. The spreadsheet did not know how to listen to a generator the way a doctor listens to a heart. The streamlined assessment did not know that the warning in the comment block was not a legacy engineer protecting his relevance, but a man trying to make sure whoever came after him could do what needed doing in the dark. He did not go back to prove them wrong. He went back because a child in the NICU needed a machine to keep breathing. And when that is true of you, the arithmetic of pride becomes very simple. Maya had understood before most adults would have. She had sat in a security office in the middle of the night, watching her father's face on a monitor, and she had not been afraid. She had been waiting. She had known he would fix it, not because fathers are supposed to fix things, but because she had been watching him fix things her whole life, quietly, without credit, and she knew in the wordless way that children absorb truth, that this was who he was before anyone gave him a title for it. The lights came on. They were always going to come on, because there are people who don't need to stand under the light to keep it burning. They are the ones who go down into the dark, so that everyone else doesn't have to.